Welcome everyone, my name is Eric Holscher, as Lacey said, and this talk is about documenting Django code in 2022. That is this year, for those of you in the future. So I want to start off just with a little bit of a story. I actually went to my first conference in about 3 years, about a month ago in DjangoCon in Porto, and I was sitting at lunch and talking to people and they're like, we have all these frameworks for thinking about code. You know, we're here at a Django event. It's all about kind of this framework. And they were like, I really wish there was a framework for thinking about documentation. Like all of this work we've put into the tech ecosystem around code really feels like the kind of philosophy around documentation isn't as advanced as we hope. And it was very convenient that at that very conference, Daniele Persada was presenting on a framework all about documentation. And that's part of what I'm going to talk about today. And it's really exciting that we actually are starting to have a little bit more of this work going into the larger picture of how to think about this stuff, right? And I think that's a big part of what's really helpful for people getting started. So why should you listen to me? I'm one of the co-founders of Read the Docs and Write the Docs is kind of the most important things. Read the Docs is a documentation hosting service that works in open source as well as commercial settings. And then Write the Docs is actually a global community of people who care about documentation. So we've historically had events in Portland, Prague, and in Australia as well, in Melbourne. And so we have this global community of people who are kind of thinking about documentation and doing this work. So today we're going to focus on kind of 4 elements, of which authoring is going to be kind of a little more than half of the talk, because that is where we spend more than half of our time, right? When you're actually doing documentation, a lot of the work you're doing is actually writing documentation, right? And then after that, we're going to talk a little bit more about kind of the other stuff, right? How do we present it to the world? What does the design look like? How do we make the user experience a little bit nicer? And then how do we get it online in front of the world? So that's going to be kind of the structure of the talk. But like I said, we're going to start off and spend a decent amount of time with authoring, because that is the act of creation, right? The act of creating documentation. So the first part we're going to start with is structure. And this is actually the framework that I was talking about with diataxis. And so some of you might not know that name, but you have probably seen something that looks like this. It's kind of gone through, it's gotten a name in the last year or two, but Daniele has been working on this for a long time, kind of this framework of how to think about documentation. One of the things that I think a lot of people is kind of, it's important to start with here, is this is organized by user needs. So when you look at this, it's actually thinking about like when the user comes, when the reader for your documentation actually comes to that site, how are they thinking about what they're trying to get out of that documentation? And so that part wasn't immediately obvious to me when I first kind of thought about this, and so I really want to kind of think through that. And so that big 2x2 chart's a little overwhelming, so I want to go through and break it down a little bit. So one of the first things is, one of those axes is the study versus work. And you can think about this, as the mode that you're in when you're going to engage with documentation, right? Are you trying to get something done, or are you trying to learn something? So sometimes you'll be in, study situations. You're trying to acquire skills, you're trying to learn a new framework, you're trying to kind of enhance your knowledge. And then after that, you're actually like doing your job. You're like, I just need to solve this problem. I have this thing I'm trying to accomplish. And that's kind of one set of concerns. To put it in a concrete example, attending this talk, you are studying. You are not actually writing documentation. But attending the sprints at this conference is much more like work. You're trying to get something done. You're trying to have output. So this is the one I struggle a little bit more with, is this kind of practical versus theoretical spectrum. Practical feels pretty straightforward, right? It's like step-by-step things. It's very kind of easy to kind of, I would almost like say it's actionable, right? It's like there is some action coming out of it, whereas theoretical is more something that's happening inside of your brain. Like you're learning something, you're kind of internalizing a way to think about stuff. So we're going to talk a little bit more about each of these kind of with examples, but I think it's good to kind of understand, what is that 2x2 grid? So we're going to go through each one. So a tutorial is practical and is study, right? When you come to a project, you really want to figure out, like, does this work for me? You're having to kind of evaluate it and learn how it works. But it's also very practical, right? Like most tutorials are like step-by-step instructions. You're typing something into a terminal. You're actually doing steps. And so that is kind of the top left of that image. How-to guides are practical, but they're for work, right? So you've learned how Django works, for example, and you go in and you're like, I want to figure out how to do a model form, or I want to add something, a field to the admin or whatever. You go in and that's where you go to a how-to guide, right? It's just step-by-step. It's very practical, but it's focused on work that you're doing, not learning, like you're at your job. Then that next quadrant is explanation, which is study but theoretical. And I actually think this is one of the places where Django is kind of really set apart. Like a lot of software documentation doesn't do this part, but Django actually has a wonderful set of guides, right? When I was kind of researching this talk, I went in and looked at the Django documentation, and there's this great performance guide. And one of the subtitles in that guide is like, understanding laziness. And it's like, that is such a like explanation, right? It's like, how do I think about laziness? I just loved that as a title, right? But it was like, here's how to think about how laziness works in Django. Here's how to use laziness in query sets to make your code do fewer queries. These kind of things are, that's not immediately actionable, but it's how do I think about building something in Django? How do I kind of understand the problem I'm trying to solve? And then lastly, this is one that a lot of people are pretty familiar with, right, is reference. This is work, but it's theoretical. And I struggle a little bit with the theoretical part on this, but really kind of I think what the framework is trying to say is that it's very concrete, right? If you go to a reference in a page of documentation, it has to be like exactly what the world is. Like it is almost certainly either generated from code or something like that, right? You're not putting it to work. It's much more about just kind of a state of the world, if you will. And so I think we all know what references are. Like in Django, for example, there's the query set API reference where it goes in and it lists all the methods. We have the template tag reference. But kind of putting that in the theoretical framework, that's the job it's doing. So I do think it's really useful to think about verbs here. And so these are all kind of examples of each one of these things, right? So a page that teaches you how to build a Django application, guiding you in step-by-step instructions. What would people say that would be in the framework? Tutorial, right. Then you have a page that shows you how to quickly add a field to the Django admin. What would that be? How-to guide. Something that explains the usage of HTTP caching and why you'd want to use it. Explanation. And then something that lists all the classes of a class-based view. Right. So pretty easy example. And it went in order of the things that I told you to make it a little easier. But it's really just, I think those verbs are super important, right? Like that is the job that is actually doing. So that's a very high-level introduction to D-Ataxis, but I think it's a really important way to actually start thinking about documentation, right? I think historically, people haven't really put a ton of deep thought into these things, and it really helps you kind of understand where to get started and how to approach this problem. And one thing I think is really interesting is the impact as an ecosystem, as more and more projects kind of adapt to this, then documentation, how to read documentation becomes a skill that we all learn within kind of the Python and Django ecosystems. So I actually think that's a really cool outcome, is if more documents start, more doc sets start being written this way, then kind of readers will know how to approach things and it will actually kind of grow the skills for everybody. So I did want to kind of show that again so that it makes a little bit more sense now, hopefully. There's obviously still a lot more kind of depth to this thinking, but I just wanted to give a high-level overview and do some marketing for D-Ataxis, because I do think documentation doesn't get enough marketing in the tech world, I would say. All right, so that is kind of the theoretical authoring section. Now we're gonna go on with a little bit more tools. And so in the kind of ecosystem, there's two that you'll probably run into the most. One is Sphinx, which is historically restructured text-based and has a lot of functionality. It is kind of old, it has been very well loved, it is heavily used, and it has a ton of features. And then MakeDocs is kind of the upstart. which is a little bit more Markdown based. It's a little slimmer, and it works well for kind of smaller things, and it's kind of growing an ecosystem, but definitely Sphinx is a little bit more heavily used, I would say. It's, Django, Python, a lot of the ecosystem is using this. So I did a pitch where I would cover both Sphinx and MakeDocs for a 45-minute talk, but with just 25 minutes, I wanted to focus on one. And so on the MakeDocs side, I will recommend you check out material for MakeDocs. If you're interested in kind of something a little lighter weight, it is a great piece of software. But I don't have enough time to cover both today. So we're going to do Sphinx. And one of the big exciting things that I think a lot of people have held people back from being excited about Sphinx is Markdown, right? Markdown is like the thing that we're all using on GitHub, on Slack, on everywhere. Basically, like Markdown has kind of become a standard for programmer text input. And so that's a big deal, is that the Sphinx ecosystem has first-class Markdown support. And that project is MyST, which basically just swaps out restructured text parsing for Markdown parsing. And so this actually works by, this is kind of the overview of the whole ecosystem with, kind of read the docs, which is working on top of Sphinx, which is working on top of docutils, which is an implementation detail we're not going to cover too much, but if you see the word as you're kind of perusing the ecosystem, you at least know where it fits in. And then docutils has a restructured text parser, and then MyST is actually a Markdown parser that generates that same internal AST. So that's how you can kind of think about it. And so what that looks like in practice is here on the left, we have kind of the table of contents tree of Sphinx that we're familiar with if you're using Sphinx much. This is basically it translated to Markdown. Looks very similar to Markdown. They use that kind of front matter that a lot of people are familiar with kind of YAML files, that kind of stuff, as the kind of argument section. So you can see how it kind of maps from one to the other. There's lots of examples like this, but the really powerful thing that they did is they took Markdown and added directives to it. So historically, there is no standard syntax for directives in Markdown, and so that's kind of the exciting part, is you can actually you can effectively call, restructured text directives from Markdown. So you have all the power of the ecosystem of Sphinx embedded in a Markdown document. And so it's pretty straightforward to install it. You just, pip install it, conda install it, add it to your Sphinx extensions, and then you just start writing files with MD extensions, and it just works. So this works really nicely for kind of pulling in existing Markdown content or kind of authoring in a mixed environment. And one of the cool things you can do is that you can actually mix these together. You want to, have some standards, right? So maybe it's just like this whole section of our docs is RST, this whole section is Markdown. You don't want to be mixing them too frequently because that'll just like melt your brain. But it is really nice if you're kind of doing a migration process, or say you have, release notes that you maybe want in Markdown, but then your API references are in RST to make it a little nicer. That is something you can do as well. So there's kind of a transition path, which is nice. So okay, we've talked a little bit about how to do authoring. You're kind of starting to make some documentation, but now you have to present it to the world, right? And that's where it gets kind of exciting, is there's been a decent amount of effort in the last few years to really improve the kind of experience of reading Sphinx documentation within the ecosystem. And the one thing I do want to highlight the most on the design side is Furo, which is a really nice new Sphinx theme that is kind of that standard 3-column layout. It looks really nice. Here's kind of a, desktop, tablet, and mobile version of it. The most interesting thing is that kind of 3-column layout. Like I said, the right side is a page table of contents, and the left side is the entire project table of contents, which is a nice way to kind of engage with documentation. And it has lots of nice features. It has the 3-column layout I mentioned. It has a nice dark mode. It's really nice to customize. It has that all kind of built in and makes it easy to add a logo or change the colors or do those kind of things. And it also is kind of becoming a standard endpoint for a lot of extensions. Like they'll support Furo kind of as a first class design output for the extension, which is nice. And one of those other kind of extensions that's come along is Sphinx Design, which is a nice way to add UI elements to your documentation. So we're very used to documentation that is just like incredibly text heavy, right? Like the internet has gone into this world where everything's really interactive and there's all sorts of rounded corners and stuff. And like, I feel like our documentation has just looked very static. And so Sphinx Design is really nice. It adds Bootstrap-based UI elements. And they actually have output for a lot of different Sphinx themes. They do Furo, some of the other ones as well. And it just makes the docs look a lot more modern, a little more interactive. So these are some of the things you can do, cards, grids, styles, all this kind of stuff are kind of the things you can support. But this is kind of a nice example where it's like, that is actually documentation that is maybe slightly washed out on the projector. But the interesting thing here, right, is you actually have this like UI element that looks much more like a landing page that you would see on a marketing site than something inside of documentation. And so you're able to kind of do all those things within your project, right? If you need a button, you need a call out, you need these kind of, just a little bit nicer kind of interface, it makes it very simple. So just as an example of what that looks like, you have like kind of a big card. If you actually like hover over it, it adds like a nice shadow and does all that stuff. And it just is kind of standard RST or Markdown syntax, which is really nice. And so that really kind of gives you as an author a lot more power to really express what you want in a set of docs. Like it's not just like text and images. You have a little bit more you can work with to express what you want. So then so now you have, really nice looking documentation with a beautiful theme, but we're all pretty used to just kind of sitting around and reading words on the page. And so I do want to talk about a few extensions in the ecosystem that work to improve the user experience, because I do think this is somewhere there's space for more innovation here as well. Like, we're doing a little bit of work, but there is definitely more that can be done to kind of improve the UX of docs. And so the first one that I want to highlight is definitely tabs. This is a very classic example, right, where you're like, here's the install instructions. We want, here's the Mac OS, here's the Linux, here's the Windows, or whatever, and you want to have like a nice set of tabs with different instructions. That just gives you a very, very simple way to do that, right? And looks very similar. It's kind of integrated into RST, works in Markdown as well. Another really kind of silly one, but I think is actually really important, right, is a copy button. This is, historically something that would have had to been built into the theme itself. But the nice thing with Sphinx is you do have this extension, right? And I mean, having a GIF of a copy button seems almost a little overkill, right? You know what a copy button does. But it's really nice, right? When you have code examples in your docs and just those little kind of affordances that make it a little nicer. So this is one that we've actually been working on personally. So is sphinx-hoverxref, which is a terrible name. We should really rebrand it. But what that does is it gives you those kind of Wikipedia-style hover cards. So if you have an internal link to your documentation, you can actually hover over the link, and then it like pulls up that content and embeds it nicely in the page. And so that's a really nice kind of affordance. It works really well with kind of API documentation, right? If you have it's like, here's the return type, and you just hover over the return type, and you're like, oh, cool. Like, I can get a little quick overview of what this type is, and I don't have to open like 6 tabs to like, tab back and forth. It just makes it a little bit nicer to kind of browse that. And the other one I want to highlight is, again, one that we've been working on, which is kind of a live search experience, right? So you're used to search on the internet. It usually is search as you type, has nice engagement, this kind of stuff. And so that's basically what this is, right? Instead of having a search where you hit enter and you go to a page and it loads results, it just has a nice UI on top of that does search as you type. So I think there's a lot of these examples where we could be building more and more kind of UX into the ecosystem, and it makes documentation better for everybody, right? The readers are going to have a much better experience. And yeah, I just think it kind of is like slowly raising the bar of like what people expect and the kind of experience they have reading documentation. And I think that's a huge, that is a way to get more value out of the work we're putting in to write docs. Because it is a lot of work. Like, writing documentation is hard. And we definitely want to make sure people are getting the value out of it when they're actually going to read it. So the last thing we're going to talk about is deployment. So this is actually my day job that I work on Read the Docs full time. And we are an open source project. And basically what we do is allow you to easily deploy Sphinx documentation. It's heavily used in kind of ecosystem. We actually host Django's PDF docs and a few others. Pip, VirtualM, Conda, a bunch of these projects use our service. And one of the cool things that's kind of notable, right, this has been around for basically 12 years now, Read the Docs has. But the cool thing is we're now kind of adding a lot more extensibility to allow you to support other kind of tools and other kind of workflows. So this is what kind of a standard YAML config looks like, right? You're just like, what OS are we running, what Python, where's your Sphinx config, and like, how do I install the project? And then we will basically just run and build Sphinx docs for you automatically. So this is kind of the traditional way that Read the Docs works. And so we have two new kind of additions, which are kind of fun, which one is called build jobs. And so this still kind of has us running the build commands. We kind of control Sphinx for you, but it allows customization on top of that. So this is great for small additions if you just want to like auto-generate a little RST file that goes in your docs, or you just have some script you want to run for some reason. So there's a bunch of different places you can kind of hook into the process where we're checking out your version control after you do the build, after we set up the virtual env or the conda environment, this stuff. So this is just kind of an example where it's like, okay, after the build, we want to hit this URL with some data, for example. I mean, who knows what that URL does? It's basically just a lightweight webhook, but that's just a very simple example of how that might work. Some other common customizations we've been kind of seeing what the ecosystem is doing here. One is installing dependencies with Poetry. We don't have kind of first-party support for Poetry, but you can just run Poetry, right? Just Poetry install, and it all just works. You can unshallow a Git clone. By default, we kind of do a shallow clone on Git just to save space and performance. But if you have some extension, a lot of people have these extensions that read the full Git history to generate release notes, for example. You can kind of manage that yourself. You can check for broken links. This is a big one. Sphinx has a built-in link checker. So you can just say like, hey, run the Sphinx, make link check before you do the build, and then cancel the build if you don't do anything, if there's broken links. So yeah, there's a lot of these kind of examples of places you can go. You can look on our docs. Actually, we have all of those cases kind of with code examples that you can copy. And the other kind of exciting part is build commands. So this basically allows you to override the entire build process, right? So this is what you think of as a kind of traditional, I don't even know, traditional kind of service. But basically, it's like you run a shell script, and whatever gets outputted in this read the docs HTML directory, we host for you. Pretty straightforward, right? So this is an example of doing Pelican. So we're actually hosting one of our own sites via this method in Pelican. And so yeah, this is basically whatever you want, right? You can just run a bunch of bash. You can run a Python script. You can do whatever. Stuff happens, HTML comes out, and then we will host it for you. And so this is pretty cool because Read the Docs has lots of power on top of it. We do versioning. We automatically index all of your stuff for search. We have a bunch of kind of features that the platform has that you can now use with basically any tool that you want. I was talking to somebody yesterday who has kind of their own pet static site generator, and I'm like, yes, come, use it, give us feedback. So this is a pretty exciting new possibility. For the longest time, we were like, only supported Sphinx. And it's still the biggest thing we support, but now you can kind of bring your own tool as well. So hopefully at the end of this talk, you will go back to your company and you will kind of introduce some of these practices, right? You're gonna start thinking about writing your docs with Diataxis. They're gonna be built with Sphinx. They're gonna be themed beautifully with Furo. They're gonna be enhanced with a few of these extensions that I've talked to you about, and then deployed online to read the docs. That is kind of the happy path, I would say, for the ecosystem if you're looking for a way to create documentation today. So that was very fast, 25 minutes. But thank you all for listening. I really appreciate it. I don't think we have time for questions, but please do go forth and make happy users with your documentation.